Thanks to Diana and colleagues here to invite me to speak in this to discuss this excellent report. I mean, what I have to say, and I want to congratulate Philipp and co-author of OECD, that you don't really see a report that combines really well-grounded empirical analysis using different data sets, along with very clear policy guidance too. So this combination of very rich empirical analysis, along with very clear policy guidance, is not something you often see in a report. So it's really, Philipp, not only I think this report is important from a policy point of view, I would say for many colleagues here, many PhD students, early career researchers, a lot of directions research the report throws out. I mean, in other words, you can read the report and say, okay, here's a very interesting research question I can explore using, available secondary data, but also obviously also qualitative data. And that's great. I mean, it's also really important from a research point of view, apart from a policy point of view. So what I want to say is I want to speak about the report a slightly different way. I want to draw from the work that we're doing, so I should say on the domain lead for ACRC structural transformation on the lead, but there are a lot of us working on this area from both in cities, but also in my institution, UNU-WIDER. So I'm going to draw a little bit from our work and speak to your report in a different way. And hopefully that makes a little bit more interesting conversation. So let me summarize the report. And I think Philipp's already done that, but it's such a rich report, cannot really summarize in one slide, but I tried doing that. So, first of all, we can, as Philipp said, urbanization can have large payoffs in Africa. And that's really important for a policy point of view. Urbanization matters. Cities in Africa are more productive than rural areas, by factors of 2, 3, 4. And it's quite remarkable, the difference in productivity in cities in Africa versus rural areas, which also goes along with what we know about cities elsewhere. Also, the report says that small and medium-sized cities can deliver similar benefits to large cities, which is good to know, because you don't want to see the kind of congestion we see often in the Asian cities where everybody moves to Bangkok, Mumbai, or Delhi, or wherever, and that leads to also a lot of negative effects. So it's good to know that you can have a more balanced industrialization with small and medium cities also being part of this, and urbanization industrialization. Of course, also the report mentioned national development plans need to center on cities. And that's important because cities sometimes get forgotten in the national apparatus, and that's what's important to keep in mind. And finally, the report says local governments need to have greater capacities, resources, fiscal resources, responsibility to support economic development. And I think that's also very important to highlight here, because we need to think about the capacity of local governments, which often where we don't see investment capacity, and how also they can mobilize resources, like municipal tax and so on, to finance urban development. So all of these things are absolutely important. And I think they are really, I would not disagree with any one of these policy implications. So what I want to say a little bit about, just stepping back a little bit about urbanization in Africa, is that one of the things that really is surprising with African urbanization is a lack of structural transformation. I'm not the first to say this. This has been said by others also. But this particular graph that we put together using macro data is striking, because if you look at this data, you can see that share of employment manufacturing versus GDP per capita, Sub-Saharan Africa is right at the bottom. It hardly has any share of employment manufacturing. Manufacturing is seen as a driver of structural transformation. I don't necessarily think the only driver, but it is the most important driver, perhaps. And you can see the difference in GDP. So even if you look at South Asia, that's SA there. I'm not sure this will work, but oops. Right. So if you can see South Asia right up there, the scatter plot on the left, with GDP per capita, the urbanization rates don't differ between South Asia and Africa, not by a whole lot. GDP per capita or urbanization. So South Africa does South Asia much better on structural transformation than Sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, we also have a graph that looks at 1990. In 1990, South Asia, and I don't present the graph, people will be on lack of time, but 1990, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia were very close on structural transformation, given GDP per capita. And then this big shift up in South Asia versus Sub-Saharan Africa. And you're not even comparing Sub-Saharan Africa to MENA or East Asia and America, because these are very different regions. So you see that on GDP per capita, strikingly on urbanization. In fact, South Asia's urbanization rate is lower than Sub-Saharan Africa. And this is 2015 data, so fairly recent, while structural transformation in Sub-Saharan Africa is significantly lower than South Asia and for a given urbanization rate. So that's a real puzzle. Why are we seeing urbanization in Sub-Saharan Africa and we don't see structural transformation? I should say that pretty much any region which has developed over time, urbanization has led to certain transformation. That's a fact, that's a silent fact. The only region missing right now in the story is Sub-Saharan Africa. Why? So that's a really important question. Next one, I want to make that, having said that, we should be careful that not all countries in Sub-Saharan Africa follow a similar pattern. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the relationship. So you can see this here, so many countries in here. I want to keep all the countries in the graph, in the scatter. So we have share of employment manufacturing versus PDB per capita. And you can, on this side of the scatter, you can see share of employment manufacturing versus urbanization rate. So you're looking at both per capita income and urbanization rate on the horizontal axis. And you can see some countries like Senegal is doing very well. Then there are countries like Tanzania or Mozambique, which are doing very badly. So even within Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, see a lot of heterogeneity in the relationship of transmission and urbanization. Though on average, Sub-Saharan Africa is doing very poorly on social transformation, given its urbanization rate. So you need to keep in mind there's a lot of heterogeneity in this relationship. Now, one of the other things I want to say, and this is work we're doing using census data, using population census, economic census, or all kinds of data sets which have give us granular information on enterprises, that even within cities in Africa, and this is Accra, we have a map for Accra, we're doing it for other cities in ACRC, we see big differences. So you see, for example, productivity across districts in Accra. So this is Greater Accra, we look at productivity, productivity, labor productivity, that's value added or sales over number of workers in enterprise. And you can see big differences productivity in this is one city, Accra. You can see in this part, in here, right there at the bottom, you can see much higher productivity than you can see in other parts of Greater Accra. But why is that? Why do we see this big concentration of productivity? It comes to what the report says, our accumulation benefits. And I think we need to understand that. So when you think about cities, we need to think that it's not just about cities, it's about also within cities. So cities unit analysis might be slightly misleading because really the action might well be within cities. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And also you can see this also here, the spatial variation of within cities matter, distribution of firms within Accra, so all enterprises, manufacturing, services. You can see again, big concentration in some parts of Accra, not else. Now you might say, well, look at this graph. This graph is not strongly correlated with the one I showed before, because it's also true that some parts of the city are very productive in Accra. But there are a lot of enterprises which are not very productive, and they may be a little bit different parts of the city. So productivity and enterprise location slightly different, right? And that's again the acceleration story that the report talks about. So just to sort of make the point that while we look at cities, we should not forget that maybe the real story is within cities. Why is that? Right? So I'm going to show you a couple of things which are using a framework we use in ESSEC, the Effective States Intervention Center, which precedes the CRC. And some of you might have seen this before. Apologies if you have seen this, but not applied to cities. In the work we did earlier, it was applied to the countries. So this is a range space we have now for Accra and Harare. We're going to do it for other cities. Again, using enterprise survey data, again, population census data, and again, and this is hard to say the city teams working with us, and it's absolutely superb, because it's not easy to generate this kind of numbers. It's not easy at all. So what do we have here? So here we have, let me explain to you what they are. So we have 4 axes. We have rentiers on top, we have medicians on this side, bottom, right at the bottom are bow brokers, and right on the other side are workhorses. What are they? So rentiers are mining, oil and gas, exporting in high rent sectors or non-competitive sectors. So you're a mining company, pretty much you might have the only license in the country, right? Medicians are tradable manufacturing, tradable services, competitive sectors who are exporting. So medicians are exporting, tradable services, manufacturing mostly. Then we have workhorses which are non-tradable services, non-competitive manufacturing, competitive manufacturing, but most in the informal sector, Because even in the informal sector in Africa, much of it is in services, non-tradable services like street vendors and so on, right? And a little bit in manufacturing. And then we have power brokers, which are essentially utility companies, construction companies, who are in non-competitive, non-tradable sectors, right? But what do we see? Well, the rent space for African city, if you use Accra and Harare, pretty much dominated by workhorses. Well, hardly rentiers, that's not surprising. You don't expect to see an oil and gas company based in the city, right? And they mostly in more remote areas, but pretty much all workhorses. But that's a problem. Why? Because workhorses are not the most productive sector. This is the non-tradable, informal service sector. not productive at all, right? And the magician's almost missing. If I did the same graph, and I don't have the data because I did it for Shanghai or some Asian city, it would look very different. It would look very, very different. Like even if you think of any city in South Asia, also if you look at Dhaka, it would look very different. Right? So that is itself a feature that we're seeing. Power brokers a little bit more Harare, more so we're excited construction companies, telecom companies, but by and large, it's a story dominated by workhorses. Least productive part of the city's economic activities, right? Now, so the puzzle that we are observing, such a transformation not being featured out in cities, could be linked to the fact that we have a whole bunch of enterprises in the least productive sector, which are workhorses. So the simple way argument would be, which is that we have made in this earlier work we did in ESSET, is push more and more activity to the issues. Because they are the most exported, they are the most competitive, productive. And that's what happened in African cities. Now, just to sort of, I'm going to not speak too much about this. So what might explain this? Why are we missing sort of this magician specially? And what might explain that from a causal point of view? Well, one argument would be, and this is work in progress, so I don't spend too much time talking about this, is that we have what we call the deal space, again, from the ESSET work. And the argument we're making from based both on political science literature, it's a very good political science literature looking at cities in Africa. Very good work. Neonathan's work on Accra is amazing, really, really good. And what we see from that and our own interviews that we did in this ACRC is basically there are local politicians, government officials who are offering what, when we say deals, these are personalized relationships. Like offer you something, and I say, okay, you might get you can set up your enterprise here. In return, what am I going to get from? Often, so to do with price, things. In the case of African cities, it's to do with votes. This is where the clientelist literature comes in. I'm going to give you this, and what I want is that you're going to vote for. Okay, so usually it's a partition, this kind of gives partition across different parts of the city, and this is where we need to do more work to think about how does that happen. So strategy towns might, for example, where some form enterprises are, the workhorses, basically is very clientelistic in that sense, right? So these are disordered because regimes change, politicians change, government officials change. So I get this deal today, tomorrow I'm not sure it will be the same deal, so I can't really invest. I'm not sure what might happen tomorrow, right? While for the power brokers, there's the big construction companies and the big electric companies, they're the ones who are getting what we call audit deals, which are the sense that once you get the deal, you know pretty much that this deal will carry on. Why? Because there's a lot of rent sharing going on between the construction company, the electric company, and the local politicians. Right? Now, I'm not going to say that everything can be explained by this causal, by this particular explanatory variable, but I think that what we want to say is that when we think about African urbanization, we need to bring in a political economy lens that can explain why we are not seeing such a transformation in the same way as every other part of the world while we think about urbanization. Thanks.